Each of the books that I'm going to talk about today has changed my view of the world in unique ways. I mean, they're not necessarily the best or most comprehensive books, or even books that I'm saying you have to read to understand the world, but rather they're the books which have produced the very specific type of brain poison to which I am subject. I mean, they are great books too. I am recommending them. So enjoy these 7-ish books which have changed the way I look at the world. So if you've ever asked for a book recommendation from me, then odds are I've told you to read this collected volume of essays edited by Tithi Bhattacharya. It's not an exaggeration to say that this book fundamentally altered my intellectual trajectory on this channel and in my wider work too. Throughout this book, authors like Nancy Fraser, David McNally and Tithi Bhattacharya explore capitalism by centering the role of the reproduction of the essential commodity of capitalism, which is labour power. By centering the production or the reproduction of labour power and the role of such reproduction in maintaining the capitalist system as a whole, this volume illuminates how gender and race are reconstituted within capitalism and provides incisive tools for understanding, among other things, neoliberalism, which, you know, I'm sure you all know how I like to try and understand all that. Another essential aspect of this collection is its theoretical critique of intersectionality by theorising a social totality in which race and gender are co-constitutive internal parts of a larger system whereby the class dimension is part of, filters and, in the last instance, shapes these other divisions. As such, it overcomes an externalised ontological separation of such divisions as race, class and gender, which is present within intersectional theory. Even in some of the better intersectionality theories, this sort of ontological distinction remains present. Finally, in some of these essays, there is an analysis of movements which organise around socially reproductive demands like housing or access to water, access to healthcare, or, you know, access to education, things like that. The book makes a case on the revolutionary value of such movements, which is beyond any case made by new social movement theory, and one which is often entirely sidelined by strands of orthodox Marxism, which tend to emphasise the role of the worker and labour unions as the revolutionary actor and the revolutionary praxis. So when I was reading this book and came across these arguments, I was immediately reminded of the work of Paul O'Connell, who found that human rights and human rights-based groups have in some cases been really effective in mounting radical challenges to neoliberal politics. And there seemed to be, I thought, a connection between the privatisation of socially reproductive areas like, you know, health and education and the generation of human rights-based social movements. And this is a connection which is literally at the heart of my PhD research right now, and I owe that insight to this book. It literally changed the way I think about my research. I really can't overemphasize how much this particular book and others in the same Pluto Press series changed the way I think. By the way, Pluto Press series, if you want to get them, Duncan50, discount code will get you 50% off all Pluto Press books. Just noticed how low the buttons on my shirt are. It's because it's hot. It's hot. It's very hot out. It's very hot. I'm sweating. I'm not built for this heat. I also just noticed that I forgot to check if this camera is stable. Let's actually just do that now. Related to social reproduction theory is Silvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch. In fact, Federici and her work in the Wages for Housework campaign has been considered one of the foundational thinkers within Marxist feminism and social reproduction theory. Caliban and the Witch is, in my view, one of the essential studies of the development of gender as a class relation. In the book, Federici tracks the production of capitalist gender relations, capitalist patriarchy, through the enclosures of common land and the divisions created by proletarianisation between productive labour and reproductive labour. This reproductive labour was then subordinated to productive labour and placed disproportionately on the shoulders of women. And as part of this, women were disciplined through the immense violence of the witch hunts. Federici's examination of capitalist patriarchy, like SRT's, tracks the internal relations of gender and race rather than just setting aside gender as a hermetically sealed social relation. Federici shows how the role of colonisation and racialisation is essential to the construction of patriarchal capitalism, or capitalist patriarchy. Swings and roundabouts. Just as the witch hunts in Europe reoriented the social relations of gender, so too did colonialism impose the European gender relations upon the colonial subject. The heteronormative European gender binary and modes of gender oppression were exported, altered and racialised within the colonial and slave context as an essential part of the genocidal domination of colonialism and slavery. And in tracking this process, Federici redefines the core Marxist concept of primitive accumulation. Rather than just being the accumulation of capital or land required to kickstart capitalism, Federici's primitive accumulation includes the accumulation of capitalist social relations so that capitalism can be kickstarted and maintained. This is another insight which has been absolutely central to my view of neoliberalism that I propose in my PhD and in this channel. In privatising means of social reproduction, neoliberalism reproduces the social relations which maintain capitalism. It's an ongoing process of primitive accumulation, because in privatising these means of social reproduction, they tend to get subordinated again back to gendered subjects, back to women. And this sort of insight has been really essential in developing my thinking. It is important to note that Federici has been criticised for some historical errors in the study, particularly on the scale of the European witch hunts. But similarly, those who have pointed out such errors have often been quick to point out that this doesn't compromise the legitimacy of our conclusions and theory. Another criticism to bear in mind is that Federici's location of women's subordination arguably overemphasises the body as the source of that oppression, which can lead to some quite bad biologically essentialist understandings of patriarchy, and can be consistent with and used by transphobia and transphobes. But this is far from an argument that Federici makes in the book, but it is worthwhile and valuable to keep this tendency in mind when you're engaging with the work, and worthwhile engaging with other works like Raha's essay in Transgender Marxism, which goes into some extent about this sort of thing, and Aaron Jaff's book on social reproduction theory, which also deals with this tendency explicitly. But with that in mind, this is still an absolutely essential book which I thoroughly recommend. Another book which similarly reconceptualises primitive accumulation, this time focusing on contemporary processes of Indigenous recognition politics in Canada, is Glenn Coulthard's Red Skin, White Mask. For Coulthard, the liberal politics of recognition and reconciliation of Indigenous peoples is a less violent, though violence is still obviously ever present in the colonial context, but it's a less violent means of maintaining colonial relations and the conditions for settler colonial genocide, i.e. the continued dispossession of land and a subjectifying process whereby Indigenous nationalisms are subsumed within the settler state, and Indigenous peoples are encouraged to recognise the settler state, more so than the settler state recognises Indigenous sovereignty. Coulthard draws a lot on Fanon, particularly, obviously, black skins, white masks. Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, by the way, almost made it onto this list, but it didn't. For reasons, you can cancel me for that at some point. It draws on Blackskin's white mask to demonstrate how seeking liberation through the structures of a settler state serves to reinforce Indigenous colonial subjectivities rather than break from them. And this has an obvious impact in how I view the state and our interactions with the state, especially, not limited to, our engagement with settler colonial states. But with these dual concepts of dispossession and subjectification, we return to the concept of primitive accumulation. Coulthard draws on the work of David Harvey and of one Silvia Federici to make the case that primitive accumulation is not temporally limited to a time previous to capitalism's emergence, but an ongoing and continued process of dispossession, which in turn produces and reproduces colonial Indigenous subjectivity. As well as being just a fantastically written, clear and incisive book, this analysis of primitive accumulation has had a deep impact on my conceptualization of the dispossession of the means of social reproduction under neoliberalism as an ongoing process of primitive accumulation, which maintains the conditions for capitalism. But outside of my specific research, Redskins White Masks constructs a Marxism which is embedded within indigenous politics, a methodology or tool which can be used and altered by subaltern groups to analyse and attack the conditions of their own oppression. This isn't a dogmatic Marxism which dictates how people should act, subordinating the movement to the theory, but one in which the theory is in dialogue with the movement, grounded within them. This is, I think, an essential difference in how different Marxists view the utility of Marxism. Something that has, I hope, had a large impact in how I think. Now, at risk of seeming like a bit of a kiss-ass, this is my supervisor's book. It is genuinely excellent though, and essential for anyone who's seeking to understand what genocide actually is. In this book, Damien reconceptualises genocide through the work of the originator of the term, Raphael Lemkin, rather than simply a process of mass killing, which is the definition of genocide which has been dominant since the drafting of the UN Genocide Convention, a convention which Lemkin was ultimately dissatisfied with. Short constructs genocide as a process in which the destruction of a people is the core defining principle. This doesn't necessarily entail the physical destruction of people, though of course it often does, but includes the cultural destruction too, through things like the banning of languages, or, like we just talked about with Coulthard, the process of making indigenous people identify with the settler state. And indeed, Short and Lemkin view colonialism as always and innately genocidal. In Lemkin's words, genocide is the destruction of the national pattern of the oppressed group and the imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor. This, of course, has some serious political implications, right, for settler colonial and imperial states, which is why Lemkin couldn't get his expanded definition through the UN. There was some reason why the British Empire didn't like such views. But this view still remains challenging to power today, as Short emphasises the role of ecological destruction in the dispossession of indigenous lands, as neoliberal capitalism continues to push us to environmental catastrophe. Short terms this as ecocide, and it is a concept which remains controversial in some circles, particularly with lawyers.
Can you imagine a world without lawyers?
So the implications for my work here, and for anyone who's familiar with my channel, the implications are quite clear. But beyond just understanding concepts in the book, the implications of the utility of international legal instruments for radicals is also questioned here. Like, the reason the book had to be written is because Lemkin's original formation was written out of the international legal order. It suffered from what's called the paradox of institutionalization, whereby the radical concept is taken by the hegemonic legal order and moulded into something which is acceptable to capitalism and colonialism. This has been pretty foundational in how I approach my human rights research, which at this point is firmly against, or at the very least deeply suspicious of, moves to pursue change via the law or via institutionalization. It also influences my view of pursuing change through any hegemonic structure like the state. It's so hot. It's so hot. Oh, God. This collected volume of writings from disabled scholar and activist Marta Russell is absolutely essential reading for anyone looking to understand the relation between capitalism and disability. Through these writings, Russell creates a framework for understanding disability as a socially and economically situated phenomenon. But more than this, Russell argues that disability is a central contradiction within capitalism. As capitalism simultaneously forces non-disabled people into the workforce, it forces disabled people out of it. excluded them from the means of production and, crucially as well, from the means of reproduction. This is due to the fact that under capitalism the body becomes increasingly regulated as a machine where the commodity of labour power is regularised to lower the cost of production to capital. As such, Russell argues disabled people have increasingly become a class of surplus population who need to be controlled, contained and segregated from society through institutions like the prison or the mental institution, where they're often used as commodities to further generate profit. This also translates into an exclusion of disabled people from the means of social reproduction like healthcare and education. They're systematically segregated due to their position as surplus. These insights from Russell have been foundational in my understanding of the ways in which disabled people are consistently sidelined and killed in the ongoing COVID pandemic. Their lives are positioned unfavourably against the imperatives of capitalism. These forces have also influenced my work in understanding the central processes of neoliberalism as an ongoing exclusion of people from the means of social reproduction, which disproportionately hurts and kills disabled people. And another central way in which Russell's work here has impacted my thinking is her total rejection of workers' tendencies within the left. Such tendencies accept bourgeois capitalist frames of the world which valorise work as the most essential feature of class politics. You see this all the time in actually existing socialist states like the USSR and throughout left politics well, which emphasise the central value of, quote, working people. Such views inevitably marginalise disabled people who are excluded from work and plays into the same surplus population tendency which is so central for capitalism. So for revolutionary politics to be successful, it needs to shed such narrow workerisms and embrace a class politics which includes all the oppressed classes of the world without privileging one at the expense of others. And this is a motivation which I've tried to maintain throughout my developing political thought. So related to the exclusion of certain groups as surplus population or as social waste is Akion Bembe's Necropolitics. In this book, Bembe builds on Foucault's concept of biopolitics as the way in which power operates to control and manage all aspects of life as opposed to previous forms of sovereign power, in which primacy was given to the ability to take the life of a subject, often publicly. Bembe viewed biopolitics as relegating the role of death as a means of social control to the edge of power rather than at its central rightful place. In his words, for the continuation of a Western capitalist standard of life to be maintained, others must die. An argument which has obvious significance as global warming continues to rip through the global south and has now made its terrible way to the global north. For Bembe, the figure of the migrant is absolutely essential to the development of necropolitics, especially as global warming creates more displaced people. Migrants are viewed as inhuman, hollowed out threats that must be contained via borders and camps and policing. The border is definitionally about separating who must die and be kept close to death and who should be allowed to live. And this has been absolutely essential to my border abolitionist politics and police and prison abolitionist politics in general, but has also come into contact with social reproduction theory. In Tithi Bhattacharya's volume, one essay examines the role of migrant domestic workers in Canada who maintain the lives of middle class and wealthy white Canadians. These migrant workers are often kept in precarious conditions due to this border politics, which keeps them in a position close to death. As such, they're placed in a kind of necropolitical subjectivity. And furthermore, relating to Russell and disability politics, Bembe argues that those populations which are deemed surplus are kept in death worlds, a concept he borrows from Frantz Fanon. Another reference to Fanon, but again, he's not on this list. Where these surplus populations are kept in constant proximity to death. This is spoken about largely in terms of colonial, neo-colonial and migrant cases in the book, but in light of Russell's description of surplus people and the segregation of disabled people into locations like the prison, there's clear conceptual crossover at work. This necropolitical subjectification has become a central aspect of my PhD work, in which I've counterposed the neoliberal drive to create an ideal neoliberal subjectivity to the effect that that drive has had to ultimately create necropolitical subjectivities, in which several different groups, like disabled people, racialized people, are placed increasingly close to death as they don't conform to this neoliberal ideal. I will say, however, Bembe has a frankly poor understanding of Marxism and class politics, and in the sections of the book that attempt to criticise Marxism, it falls extremely short in the context of an otherwise really incisive book. But on a personal level, I read this book and the social reproduction theory book at a time in my PhD when I was getting really fatigued by it and really unsure if I had anything interesting or valuable to say. Both these books totally reinvigorated me and my research in a way which is quite difficult to describe, so I'll always have a place in my heart for this deeply, deeply depressing book. So this final book, the collected volume from Stuart Hall on Marxism, I have slightly less to say on it, not because it's any worse or than other books in this list, and it's not, it's extremely good, but because the thing that changed my thought in this book is really the first essay on Notes on Marx's Method. In that essay, Stuart Hall examines Marx's method in the most useful way I've ever come across. Central to Hall's analysis is the role of abstraction in Marx's thought. This appears to be a place in which many people have been tripped up. Rather than Marx assuming a certain condition or a type of individual as the starting point and analysis of theory, as many people have argued, Hall identifies that Marx's abstracted starting point is actually intended to invite yet further and deeper critique. As Hall argues, what appears as the most simple or concrete, common sense starting point of any critique of political economy is actually, under closer inspection, the sum of all prior determinations. The example that Hall draws on to illustrate this is Marx's argument that there's no form of production in general, rather the notion of production is historically and socially determined. The abstraction of production in general invites us to examine the prior logics and determinations of the historically specific form of production that we're looking at, i.e. capitalism. This is an insight which I worry is lost on some Marxists who view Marxism as often static and dependent on the abstraction rather than examining the concrete social formation that is in front of us. The second thing worth talking about again relates to the SRT book. It's a great book, everyone should read it. The SRT book emphasises the role of relationality and the motion present in Marxism rather than some more static understandings. Hall's analysis in this essay really emphasises just how relational Marxist thought is. No part of his analysis can exist without the other parts. They are co-constitutive, made up of one another, and in constant motion and in tension with each other. This co-constitution, motion, and tension of segments of the social whole is something which I really try to emphasise in my work. Production and reproduction, race and gender and class, hegemony and counter-hegemony, all these things are in constant relation and constant tension with each other, and it's in these tensions that we find ways to overcome oppression. Hall's essay explains all this better than I can here, so all I'll really say to finish is that if you're interested in Marx's method, the first essay in that book is the best I've ever read on it. Bonus books. So these are two books which I'm not going to get too into. I do have a review of them both on my Patreon if you want to join that. But these two books, read together, have been extremely useful in building my framework for how subjectification and social reproduction interact under neoliberalism. I've not done a deeper dive into them here because I don't feel they sort of spoke to things that I was already thinking rather than reinterpreted anything. They didn't shift anything, they sort of gave me tools. But they're still good books. So in talking about these books, you should be able to see the particular ways in which each one has impacted my political thought, and you should be able to see the echoes of them, the pretty strong echoes of them throughout many of these videos. Focus on the role of social reproduction, the rules of subjectification, and the constant awareness of the motion and tension within society. So I hope this has given you some insight into my thoughts and my research. And each of these books has been infinitely valuable, and I keep returning to them and will keep returning to them because they're going to be valuable in new ways. Such is the importance of books as these. But this is by no means an exhaustive list of books which I think are extremely important and have influenced me. I'm not even sure if it's right to say that they're the best books I've ever read, but when I sat down to think which books had the greatest impact on the way I conduct research, these were the 7-ish books that came to me. If you have any books which you think have had such an impact on you, share in the comments, because I'll always have too much to read, but I always want to read more. Managed not to melt through this, so thanks for watching. We'll be back next time with a bigger video, a more meaty video. But I thought this would be quite nice for people to get a wee look into the way I think about the issues that we come across in these videos, and the ways that the books which have been instrumental in guiding that way I think. And also I'll always take an opportunity to talk about books. I like books, they're good. Alright, thanks for watching. Thanks to all my patrons. I'll get to reading these names out in just 1 second. Again, if you want to get some cheap books, if you want to read some more, get some cheap books, then you can go to Pluto Press, where some of these ones that I mentioned here are published, and use the discount code Duncan50 and get 50% off. I get nothing from this except 50% off books too, but you know, they're a good publisher. Also, if you want to sign up to my Patreon, you get early access to videos, scripts, behind the scenes stuff, book reviews as well, monthly book reviews, which I should probably start writing this month's for. And also, if you want to give a one-off tip via PayPal or Ko-fi, then links for that are in the description. And now to read the names of $10 patrons. First off, we've got Niels Abelgard, Lizzie G, Quint Wolf, Kim Crawley, Dying of Thirst, Anita Inespi, Ellis Wren, Dan Wheatley, Esoteric Fictionalism, Shingo, Austin Talman, Robin, Rachel Mixon, Rich, Tinfoil Pancakes, Kieran Gore, Agaghost, Daniel Hughes, Tamash Kispeter, and Paul Singleton. Again, if you want to sign up to Patreon, that'd be great for me. But otherwise, you know, it's a tough time. We're all struggling right now. Next month's video, I swear I'm getting to the masculinity one. I swear it's next on my list. I'm so fucking busy. I'm so goddamn busy right now, trying to finish this fucking PhD. Anyway, good vibes here. Good vibes. Love you. Bye.